Okay, hello students. We're going to go ahead and look at or move on to the next set of notes and Unit 3, which is the Unit 3.2 notes. It's a pretty big chunk of information inside of these notes, but it all has to do with cellular respiration, which is how organisms can extract energy from organic molecules such as glucose and use it to make ATP to power their cells. So that's what we're going to look at in a lot of detail in these notes. But in this video, we're going to start with topic 1. In topic 1, we're going to look at kind of a little overview of what an oxidation-reduction reaction is, because ultimately in cellular respiration, it's just a huge collection of oxidation-reduction reactions taking place. And so we're going to talk about what that means and what's going on, big picture in cell respiration. And to do that, well, let's start with this slide. So a lot of times, so in an oxidation-reduction reaction, which a lot of times we just call it a redox reaction for short, there is going to be a movement of electrons from someone to someone else. And so in these type of reactions, in a redox reaction, someone's going to have some electrons. And then ultimately in this reaction, what we're going to see is those electrons moving from one molecule and then ending up with a different molecule. And so in these reactions, someone's going to be losing electrons, and then ultimately someone else, a different molecule, is going to be gaining electrons. And so the person who's losing electrons, or the loss of electrons, we call that oxidation. So oxidation is when someone is losing, or a process that involves the losing of electrons. And then reduction is when a molecule is gaining electrons. So in a process where a molecule is gaining those electrons, we call that reduction. There's a way to remember that, the difference between the two. Well, there's a couple different ways. I learned it as Leo goes Gur. That's the mnemonic device that I learned. Leo means lose electrons is oxidation. And then Gur means gaining electrons is reduction. So if it's gaining electrons, that's reduction. Losing electrons, that's oxidation. That's the big difference between the two. And then oftentimes those electrons, as they're being transferred from one molecule to another one, you'll also see a movement of hydrogen atoms, because oftentimes those electrons are being transferred with hydrogen atoms. So you'll also see some hydrogen atoms being lost and gained by certain molecules. Which kind of gives you an indication that that's where the electrons are going. And so here's a little kind of like a basic little schematic of what it means to be an oxidation-reduction reaction. We have this guy right here who has some electrons. And then what's going to happen is he's going to lose those electrons, and now he no longer has those electrons. And what happened is this other substance, chemical B, is the person who did not have those electrons but then ended up with those electrons. So at the end of this reaction, this guy had those electrons, this guy did not have those electrons, and at the end, now he has those electrons and he does not have those electrons. So we say that this molecule A, he is being oxidized because he's losing his electrons. And we say molecule B, he's being reduced because he's gaining electrons. So that's why we call these redox reactions, because if they're always happening together. If someone's losing electrons, well, then someone's got to be gaining those electrons. And as you can see in these pictures, those electrons are going to travel in pairs. So it's always a pair of electrons that's moving through these reactions. So that's the difference between oxidation and reduction. And like I was saying, in cell respiration, this is what we're going to see happening. And we're going to go into this in a lot of detail, but we're basically going to see in cell respiration, someone is losing a bunch of electrons. And electrons are going to be stolen from someone, and that person is going to be losing a bunch of electrons. And then ultimately, those electrons are going to end up with someone else at the end of this cell respiration process. And so for the rest of topic 1, I actually just want to focus on my whiteboard here. Let me pull this up for you guys. Maybe. Here we go. Okay, so if you look at this, I have up here the formula. This is the overall formula for cell respiration. You guys have seen this probably since middle school at least. But you have glucose and some oxygen, and ultimately it's going to become H2O and CO2. And what we're going to learn throughout these notes is that this is way more complicated than this formula leads you to believe. It looks like this is just one reaction taking place where you take a glucose, you take 6 oxygens, and then in a chemical reaction, it becomes 6 waters and 6 CO2s. But the reality is this reaction in living things actually involves, it's a huge metabolic pathway, a huge series of chemical reactions that take place that will ultimately lead to these things becoming these things. But we're going to be looking at like 20 plus different chemical reactions that this actually is taking place in. It's a lot of different chemical reactions to get the glucose and this oxygen to ultimately become these things here, which will then, this is an exergonic reaction. It releases free energy. This is something the universe wants to happen. And that release of free energy, the cells are going to, in cell respiration, we're going to take that free energy and apply it towards making some ATP. And that's what's going to be happening here. And so I just want to show you overall, in topic 1, we're just going to look at big picture. What's the oxidation and reduction process overall look like here? So in this process of cell respiration, there is someone who is losing electrons. That's what we're going to see happening over the next week when we're talking about this. You're going to see in the story, someone's going to be losing electrons. And then ultimately those electrons have to end up with someone, and someone's going to gain those electrons at the end of this long story that we're going to talk about starting this next week. And so the person who we're going to lose, or who we're going to steal electrons from, the person who's going to lose electrons is glucose. So glucose is a nice organized, more complex molecule, C6H12O6, all very organized stuff. We would say it's a higher energy molecule. The universe doesn't really like it. And inside glucose, there's some high energy electrons that exist in the chemical bonds that are holding the atoms together. There's a bunch of covalent bonds, and they're all sharing electrons. And those are some, we call them high energy electrons that are inside of glucose that we're going to steal. And so hopefully you recall from your chemistry classes that there's electrons, but those electrons can be higher energy or lower energy electrons depending on how much energy they have. And what we're going to do is take high energy electrons away from glucose. So just know there's some high energy electrons in this glucose molecule, and we're going to be stealing them, taking them away. And so he's the one who's going to be oxidized. Now, when he loses electrons, so slowly over many chemical reactions, we're going to be taking electrons from him, taking electrons from him, taking electrons from him, little by little. And ultimately, it will be 12 pairs of electrons that we're going to steal from this molecule, starting with glucose. But as we steal molecules away from glucose, that's going to change. This molecule is going to change into something else as electrons are being stolen from him. And so what we're going to see happening is that glucose, as those electrons are being stolen from him, he's going to become CO2 molecules. And so really, ultimately, what's happening is this sugar, as electrons are being stolen from him, and we're breaking these covalent bonds that are holding these atoms together, we're going to see a bunch of CO2 molecules being produced as a result. And so on here, I'm going to show it like this. Electrons are going to be stolen from glucose. And as those electrons are stolen from glucose, he's going to become CO2. That's what's going to happen here. And so we're going to say, since he's losing electrons, that's oxidation. So he's the one being oxidized. He's going to be losing electrons. I'm going to label this oxidation. Now, where do those electrons end up? So he is going to be losing electrons. Those electrons have to end up somewhere. And really what's going to happen, which you won't really see until the very end of the story of cell respiration, those electrons will ultimately, they're going to go through a long journey, but they ultimately will end up with oxygen. Oxygen is going to be the person who gains those electrons at the very end of this series, this metabolic pathway. Ultimately, those electrons that started from glucose, they're going to be given to oxygen. And so I'm actually going to draw this up here. What we're going to see is a movement of electrons from glucose to oxygen. We're going to see a bunch of electrons being taken from glucose, ultimately given to oxygen. Okay, that's literally what's going to happen during cell respiration in a very complicated way. Electrons are going to start from glucose, and we're going to give them to oxygen. And so oxygen is going to be the one who receives and gains those electrons. And when oxygen gains those electrons, it's going to change the molecule of oxygen. That O2 molecule is going to change, and it actually becomes water. And so when oxygen is reduced, when it gains electrons, it becomes water. So since oxygen is the one gaining electrons, we're going to say that that's reduction. And so that's what's going to happen. So glucose is going to lose those electrons. As he's losing electrons, he's going to become CO2. If you recall, I told you that usually when you're losing electrons, the hydrogen atoms are being taken with the electrons. Those electrons are usually traveling with hydrogen atoms. And so you can see that glucose, yeah, it's going to start losing electrons and losing his hydrogen, which is slowly going to break him apart into CO2 molecules. And then oxygen is going to gain those electrons at the end of this process. And when he gains those electrons, and like I said, those electrons are usually traveling with hydrogen atoms, he's going to become H2O, water molecules. And so that's ultimately big picture what's happening during cell respiration. And this happens in kind of a complicated series of steps that we're going to tackle together in class, starting in topic 2 and then into topic 3 of the notes. But what's important for you guys to know now is that the sugar, the organic molecules that you guys are eating from your food, which a lot of that is carbohydrates and sugars that are going to be broken down into glucose, simple sugars like glucose. Ultimately, that is going to be used in cell respiration to do this process to release energy and to make ATP, and that becomes CO2. So the CO2 you guys are breathing out, I need you to understand this starting right now, the carbon dioxide that you guys are releasing from your bodies and that most living things, all living things on this planet are producing, the CO2, that comes from the glucose, the sugar, the food that organism was using. Okay, that's where that CO2 comes from. It's your food. So that's the CO2 that you guys are releasing out of your body. Now, the oxygen that you guys are breathing into your body, that oxygen does not become CO2. So a common misconception is that students believe that you breathe in oxygen and then somehow in your body that oxygen turns into CO2. And that's what you release from your body. That's definitely not what's happening. The food you're eating becomes CO2. The oxygen you guys are breathing in actually becomes water inside of your body. And so that's actually going to turn into water. None of that will turn into CO2. It turns into water. And so that's what's happening through this oxidation reduction process. Now, to make this one more step more complicated, in topic 1, it talks about how to move these electrons from glucose to oxygen, it's going to involve these electron carrier molecules. So there's these molecules whose job is to literally carry the electrons from one molecule to a different molecule. Like that's their whole job. And there's a few different types of electron carrier molecules that we're going to talk about in Unit 3. But again, these are molecules whose job basically is just to transport electrons that they stole from someone and bring them somewhere else. And in cell respiration, one of the main electron carrier molecules that we're going to see is NAD+. NAD+ is it's technically a coenzyme. So it's a small molecule who helps enzymes perform different reactions, basically by providing them with electrons that they're going to need for those reactions. And so what he does, though, it says this molecule called NAD+, he's going to swoop in and take electrons, ultimately, that used to belong to glucose. So glucose is going to have these electrons, and here let's track the electrons. Here's another way to think about it. So in glucose, there's all these different pairs of electrons. And there's not just one pair of electrons, there's a lot. But let's just say we're tracking one pair of electrons being stolen from glucose. That pair of electrons being stolen from glucose, it's actually going to be stolen by an electron carrier molecule. So an electron carrier molecule during a reaction is going to swoop in, and those electrons are going to be given to him. And so when those electrons are given to him, NAD+ becomes NADH. And so NADH is NAD+ once he's holding on to these high energy electrons that he stole from glucose. So I'll track them down here. So those electrons are starting with glucose, but then NAD+ is going to swoop in and take those electrons from glucose and now carry them away as NADH. So now he's NADH, and when he exists as NADH, we know he's holding on to those high energy electrons that he stole from glucose. Now, like I said, as glucose is losing those electrons, we're going to see glucose slowly start becoming CO2 molecules. So as we take electrons and more electrons and more electrons and more electrons away from glucose, which is NAD+, taking them, you're going to see the glucose become CO2. And then the NADH is now holding onto those high energy electrons, and his job is to go transport them somewhere else. So he's going to carry those electrons somewhere else. And ultimately, he's going to carry those electrons to a location where oxygen is going to receive them. So then oxygen, what's going to happen is those electrons that NADH, if you guys follow these arrows here, those electrons, those high energy electrons that NADH is holding onto, he's going to give them to oxygen. Eventually, they're going to end up with oxygen, and oxygen is then going to become water once he receives those high energy electrons. So now, really at the end, those electrons are going to end up, be passed along to oxygen, who's now going to turn into water holding on to those electrons. And then NADH, when he gets rid of those electrons, he's going to go back to being NAD+. And then the cycle continues, and then he goes back and steals more electrons, becomes NADH, takes those electrons, flies away, brings them to oxygen. Oxygen takes those electrons, becomes water, and then he goes back to being NADH. And even in this, you guys can see there's a series of oxidation-reduction reactions happening. So glucose is losing electrons, that's oxidation. NAD+ is gaining those electrons, that's reduction. And then NADH is going to lose those electrons at some point, that's oxidation. And then oxygen is going to gain those electrons, that's reduction. So you have oxidation, reduction, happening over and over and over and over again, taking these electrons and ultimately giving them to someone else who's going to end up with those electrons. And then at the end, like I said, it's oxygen who's going to end up with them. So we call oxygen the final electron acceptor. So that's an important concept to start. We're going to go over this a lot, but maybe starting right now, just know that oxygen ultimately is the one who's going to end up with these electrons. It's his job to take those electrons at the end and become water. So oxygen is the final acceptor. He's going to be the final one to accept these electrons at the end of cell respiration. And so, and then you will eventually end up with these guys at the end, water and CO2. So, like I said, in topic 2 and 3, we're going to explore in a lot of detail what this actually looks like, which involves a lot of different reactions and a lot of different proteins and a lot of different series of reactions taking place in different spots in the cell. And so we'll look at that, and you guys will see it's a lot more complicated than you might have initially learned in middle school or freshman bio. But it's kind of cool once you understand how this is all actually happening. But really, this is big picture. Like overall, this is what's happening during cell respiration, and then we're going to zoom into the details over the next couple videos. But anyway, so one last thing, I'm sorry, that I wanted to show you guys is, like I said, NAD+, he's an electron carrier molecule who carries those electrons and takes them somewhere else. There's actually, so he's the main one we're going to see. We're going to see him a lot during cell respiration, taking electrons from glucose and then ultimately bringing those electrons so that they end up with oxygen. But there's another one also, and I just want you guys to know, because it does talk about this also in topic 1. The other one that we're going to see in cell respiration, which we're only going to see him at one certain spot during cell respiration, but he's just like NADH. He's an electron carrier molecule, but he's called FAD. So there's another one called FAD. You're going to see this guy called FAD. And he does the exact same thing. So what he does is he swoops in, he's going to take some electrons sometimes, and when he takes electrons, he becomes FADH2. That's what he becomes when he gains those electrons. So when he gets reduced and gains those electrons, he becomes FADH2, and then he carries those electrons and brings them to oxygen. So he's just like NAD+. FAD is very similar to him. They do the same thing. They're both electron carrier molecules. But this one starts as FAD and becomes FADH2 when he gains those electrons before bringing them to oxygen. And then he repeats the cycle just like NAD+. That's his job. But that's basically it for topic 1. Thank you guys. I'll see you later.